So with that, I want to welcome you to what I consider one of the most critical statements that the Society has made in many, many years. This weekend, we are going to address a socio-economic phenomenon that is more significant and has more implications for humanity than the Industrial Revolution. And I made that statement to an individual the other day, and they said, "Oh, how can that be?" And I said, this is the first time in mankind's history, at least as far as we know, that we have been able not only to communicate with one another around the world instantaneously, but it is also a time when people on the other side of the globe can know what we are doing at the moment we're doing it. That is incredible. And that is an issue that we, as all of humanity, must face up to and recognize its implications for where we're going to be 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now. The second reason that I am so excited about this conference is that it gives those of us who are in the Society an opportunity to say welcome to those who are just learning about us, and to give a special welcome to anyone who says, I think it makes a whole lot of sense to find a meeting ground that truly is common, that does go beyond all of our little secular ideas and all of the little faith traditional accoutrements that we bring to the table. And I want to say tonight that already we've had, I think, 10 or 15 people say, I want to be a part of that. And with that, I will introduce Betty to take the conference.
Thank you. So the Theosophical Society in America welcomes you to this conference, this regional conference. I think it's a real historic thing, and we're looking forward to being able to make Theosophy available in various regions of the country, and we will see how it goes. I think that it can stimulate contact among our national members, and also can draw members to the groups that are already present. I am Betty Bland, the president, in case you do not know me. The Theosophical Society was founded in 1875 in New York City by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Steele Alcott, two of its primary principal founders. And the international headquarters were moved to Chennai, India, and the national center was moved to Wheaton, Illinois in 1926. So we have had our center in Wheaton, Illinois for quite some time. And the Society is a membership organization with 3 objects. The first object is to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, regardless of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. And of course, this conference relates very much to that first object, trying to bring various faiths together to be able to interact with each other in a harmonious and brotherly and sisterly way. The second object of the Society is to encourage comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. And then the third object is to investigate the unexplained laws in nature and powers latent in humanity. Or, as restated in our mission statement, the Society encourages open-minded inquiry into religion, philosophy, science, and the arts in order to understand the wisdom of the ages, respect the unity of all life, and help people explore spiritual self-transformation. And we hope that you meet interesting people and ideas here, and that you might like to continue in these pursuits. The Theosophists come from all faiths and all walks of life and have a common interest in discovering truths, applying those truths to daily life, and to finding fellowship with others of like mind. And although it can be called by many names, a sangha, a community, a congregation, or a spiritual family, several people joined together in a spiritual search are stronger than one traveling that road alone. So we invite you to join with us in our explorations at whatever level suits you. It has almost become trite to say that we're living in one of the most challenging times of human history. Yet, at so many levels, this is true. And it is because of one fundamental development, and that is the ability to process and disseminate information, and I guess with that we would say, and to travel. There have always been communities and regions starving. There have always been economic disparity and diseases, but today, nobody in the world can ignore something that goes on in another place. Every regional crisis is a part of our family and our involvement. Governments and international organizations have an undeniable responsibility to match the human suffering with their resources and expertise. But what will motivate these organizations, these institutions, to do this great work? And I'm convinced that the force will come from people like us, that will come from each one of us living the highest ethic we know from our own tradition. And that ethic has to be expressed in our lives and in every way that we function. And we know that as the golden rule. I think that that is in most all traditions, and we have included in your folders a list of the various traditions that have that golden rule. So we must treat each other with respect and genuine concern for one another's well-being in all our encounters during this weekend and then in our lives as we go back in business, in social, and in our economic activities. May this time in the conference be a time of deep reflection, a time of commitment to the highest ethical reflections, and a time, most of all, to make good friends. The Theosophical Society is honored to have every one of you, and now would like to introduce our keynote speaker for the conference, Richard Smoley. He is a distinguished authority on the mystical and esoteric teachings of Western civilization. He is educated at Harvard and Oxford universities and the former editor of Gnosis magazine, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar. He's the author of several books, the most recent being a new release in June, but we have some copies out on the table out here by Quest Books titled Hidden Wisdom. and this includes an exploration of Western esoteric traditions. Other books by Richard, which have been released this year, are The Essential Nostradamus with Tarcher Penguin and Forbidden Faith, The Gnostic Legacy from the Gospels to the Da Vinci Code with Harper San Francisco. So he is quite a prolific writer, and in addition to that, he is the acquisitions editor for Quest Books, which is a publisher of books on spirituality and esotericism operated by the Theosophical Society. So we're very fortunate to have Richard as our keynote speaker and to start putting our minds in the direction of our globalization and spirituality with the language of possibility. Richard? Welcome, Richard.
Well, very good. Thank you, Betty, for that very warm and pleasant introduction. I want to say that Quest did a really great job producing that new edition of Hidden Wisdom. I've only just seen a copy of the final version, final copy of it right now, and I'm very pleased with it. So just want to thank everybody who's involved with that, some of whom are here tonight. Very good. Well, first off, I must say I'm very pleased and impressed that all of you wanted to forego opening night of the Da Vinci Code to show up here. Shows your very deep seriousness and earnestness about these issues. Anyway, well, what I'm going to do this evening is sketch out, I think, some of the main issues that I think face us in regard to global spirituality and perhaps even individual spiritualities and collective spiritualities. To begin, centuries don't always end when the calendar says they should. Historians sometimes speak of the long 19th century, for example, which began with the French Revolution in 1789 and ended with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The same could be said for millennia. And I personally have the sense that despite what the calendar tells us, what we're living through right now is in some indefinable way the tail end of the 20th century and the second millennium, kind of extended fin de siècle. The new era still seems waiting to be born. When and how this will happen, I don't know, and I suspect no one really does at the present. What we can say, however, is that religion will play some role, probably a crucial role, in this new era. Again, however, in the current strife that we're witnessing, we seem to be seeing the end of religion in the old sense, or some old sense, and we may hope the prelude to a beginning of a religion in a newer and more edifying sense. But before this new era of religion is to be born, we will have to deal with some crucial issues that are left over from the past. And it's these that I want to address in this talk. The word religion, as is well known, is derived from the Latin religare, which means something like to bind together or to bind back. And this points to two key functions that religion plays in human life. In the first place, it's meant to foster religious experience, to enable the individual soul to commune with the divine, that is, to bind the visible with the invisible. In the second place, it serves to cement the structure of society, upholding values and ideals that preserve the common good. Religion's function is to bind individuals both to the divine and to one another. As you can see, there's no real contradiction between these two purposes, and ideally they should work together in perfect harmony. But in fact, this rarely happens. More often than not, these two functions conflict in various ways, just as individual needs frequently clash with collective ones. One problem arises when an individual has some kind of spiritual experience that doesn't fit in with the accepted theology. This person poses an apparent threat to the established order, which regards him or her with suspicion and at times with hostility. You could even say usually with hostility. A person becomes a heretic and an outcast. If he or she has some personal charisma and spiritual experience can endow a person with precisely this sort of charisma, he may start a church or a movement of his own. Thus are new religions born. Whether or not this whole process happens, someone with access to an inner source of spiritual insight does not need religious institutions or does not need them as ordinary people do. Furthermore, such a person often has an inner authority lacking in many leaders of established religions. This was precisely the response that Jesus evoked when he began to preach. And they were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one that had authority and not as the scribes. Naturally, the scribes, those with a purely external knowledge of religion, are bound to regard this person as a threat to their power. And of course, the scribes see things differently. They view themselves as guardians of the social order. They say that society needs to have consistent patterns of belief and practice as a way of reinforcing common values. A person with an individual and independent experience of the divine threatens or is believed to threaten these values. If the religious authorities have some measure of secular power, as they did in Christ's time and in the Middle Ages, the mystic will be persecuted or put to death. If the authorities have little secular power, as they do today in the West, they will have to content themselves with condemning or simply criticizing it. Well, it's probably not wise to indulge in too much tongue-clicking over this situation. As usually happens, people end up mostly as the logic of their circumstances dictates. The spiritual visionary may say with Luther, "Here I stand, I can do no other." But the authorities on the other side of the bench could no doubt say much the same thing. They have the task of supporting and strengthening the faith of the majority and of helping them pass through the ordeals of births and deaths and marriages. They can see that most people are not interested in the subtleties of religious experience and would rather ignore them. Besides, as the clergy have long since learned, many supposedly mystical revelations are little more than symptoms of mental disorder. Consequently, religious authorities tend to downplay or discourage such experiences. They are too troublesome and unmanageable. Take, for example, the numerous apparitions of the Virgin Mary in Catholicism. Many of these at Lourdes, Fatima, Medjugorje, for example, were greeted with hostility by the local clergy, who doubted the good faith of the visionaries and also feared the challenge to their own authority. After all, people are apt to say, if the priests are so holy, why didn't the Virgin appear to them? Only later, if at all, did the Church grudgingly accept the legitimacy of these visions. As a result, the powers that be tend to discourage spiritual experience beyond a certain safe and harmless minimum. Unfortunately, religion exists partly because of the human need for direct communion with the divine, so the authorities turn out to be sacrificing one part of their job to another. Thus it happens that the history of religion follows a predictable cycle. The initial vision of a charismatic founder, who's usually persecuted by the clergy of his time, degenerates as time goes on into a collection of second-hand dogmas. The insights of a restless genius fall into a comfortable slumber in the minds of followers. At such a point, anyone who goes to that religion or institution thirsting for spiritual experience is likely to be told she is looking for the wrong thing or simply be turned away. Such, for the most part, is religion today. A modern clergy person, well-schooled in the most sophisticated and recondite theologies, might be at a total loss when confronted with a parishioner who says she's seen an angel. And people do see angels, or what they experience as angels. After over 25 years of spiritual exploration from both a personal and professional point of view, I'm constantly amazed by how many apparently ordinary people have had profound and often dazzling spiritual experiences. They're often unwilling to talk about them because they don't know whom to talk to. They may be afraid, with some reason, of seeming strange or mad. If they go to their clergyman, usually he will give them some meaningless reassurance if they're comparatively lucky, or if they're not, he'll tell them that their experience was a visitation by the devil or some other sinister force. Thus, we see religion in conflict over its two most vital functions. I believe that the spiritual crises of our time will not be resolved until there is, I do not say answer, but some accommodation between the collective needs of society and the individual's need for transcendence. I myself don't have a quick and easy answer to what is, after all, a profound dichotomy in human experience. But I suspect part of the answer lies in revising and recasting training for the religious professionals. What good, for example, does it do to know the works of Tillich and Bultmann and to understand the complexities of the textual state of the Q document, but to be totally at a loss when a parishioner says she's seen an angel or has had a visit from a loved one who's just died, another equally common experience? Well, since this is a theosophical conference, I feel safe in assuming that many of those present are aware of and sympathetic to the esoteric traditions. I might also almost say the esoteric tradition, because its commonalities worldwide are far more striking than its differences. And esotericism deals precisely with the questions I've alluded to just now. What sort of spiritual experience is valid? How does a person who has one know whether or not, and this is a frequent cause of real concern, whether she's going crazy? These are issues that overlap conventional psychology, but also go far beyond it. To even begin to address them, one has to start with the assumption that there are worlds invisible to the human eye, but with which we can nevertheless interact in a meaningful and intelligible way. Furthermore, one may be willing to accept the possibility that there is an ancient science of knowledge that has addressed these issues in the past and is still capable of doing so now. Conventional theology, which, like much of contemporary intellectual life, is in a kind of bondage to scientism, willingly or not, knowingly or not, can hardly touch such things. It does not want to say, often cannot say, what angels or devils or mystical experiences might really be. The fear of being weird or strange or far out, even institutionally, is much too acute. As a result, conventional theology, for all its high-sounding pronouncements, often seems to stumble into the trap of an unwitting agnosticism. Well, to bring up science and scientism, that is to say, science set up as a kind of pseudo-religion, is to lead into the second major theme I want to address this evening. And this has to do with a strange and almost completely overlooked fact, that the word God has come to be associated with two quite different phenomena. The confusion that this has caused serves to explain much of the animosity science and religion have felt for each other ever since modern science, as we know it, began to emerge in the 17th century. The first use of the term God is as a catch-all explanation for any phenomenon in nature that humans don't understand. This usage is extremely ancient and by all evidence goes back long before the beginning of written history. What do I mean? Well, take lightning and thunder. These are disturbing things to experience even in our own day, and it was not so long ago that people took them as evidence of the presence of some deity, Zeus or Jupiter in Greco-Roman myth, Thor in the Old Norse pantheon, and so on. Scholars even say that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures started out as a storm deity, as we see in the ending of the book of Job, where the Lord addresses Job out of the whirlwind. God, in this sense, is no longer necessary. Our understanding of natural processes is far better than it was 2 or 3 centuries ago, and science boasts that there will ultimately be none of these processes that it cannot explain. Well, that may or may not be. Advocates of scientism have proclaimed imminent triumph in this area as often as their fundamentalist opponents have proclaimed the Lord's imminent return, and just as prematurely. Nonetheless, God is no longer necessary, or perhaps even possible, as the embodiment of natural forces or as an explanation for them, at least in a purely physical sense. The sense of loss that's accompanied this realization is in many ways as great as the satisfaction bestowed by knowledge. For all its genuine advances and insights, science has tended to present a dead mechanical world that is the result of the operation of certain blind forces. The occasional exhortation from the scientistic advocate to contemplate the mysteries and glories and wonders of the universe is, in a sense, almost a smokescreen. In its way, this view of a dead, lifeless, mechanical world may be as great a superstition as the earlier ones that it supplanted, but that's not really the point of this discussion. Here, then, we have one use of the word God as a kind of explanation for the inexplicable. You see it every time you sign a legal contract, right? There's some provision made for acts of God, presumably, somebody dropping a cinder block on your head or something like that as you're walking down the street. The inexplicable, the unforeseen, the unexpected. In contrast to it, there's a use that may seem similar when in fact it isn't. God, or the divine, the numinous, whatever term you prefer, in this sense, is the name that human beings give to what's sometimes called the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the terrifying and fascinating mystery. That is to say, profound reality that repels us in awe just as much and to just the same degree almost as that it attracts us in love. This God is not a catch-all explanation or a crutch on which our sense of causality may lean, but a lived reality. The experience of countless mystics and visionaries, as well as of ordinary people, throughout the centuries, attest to the reality of this notion of God. This divine is sometimes seen as personal, sometimes as impersonal. More likely, it is beyond both personality and impersonality as we know them. And this raises an issue that I think it would be interesting to discuss at some point during the course of this weekend, because it would seem that the notion of God as ultimately radically personal, as the divine is usually portrayed in the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is at variance with what would seem to be a much more radically impersonal sense of the divine that seems to be characteristic of, generally speaking, Eastern religions, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. Now, this is, I readily grant, is an enormous oversimplification, but it has some vague general truth. And adherents of one point of view, when looking at the other, tend to regard the other as some sort of deficient halfway point. The Christian, for example, may well say that the experience of certain impersonal states, a characteristic of enlightenment, sometimes described in Eastern terms, is just kind of a way station to an encounter with a radically personal God. Viewing it from the other side, those who view religion or the ultimate truth in more impersonal terms will say, well, all of these gods, this experience of a personal God is itself just sort of like a way station, just kind of a conceptual manner of thinking. I'd be very interested to hear what the advocates of various, exponents of various faith traditions this weekend have to say on this point. My own view is that what we conceive of as the divine is very likely radically beyond the personal and the impersonal as we know it. Why? Well, take the example of two blood cells that are swimming around in some vein of yours. Right? Let's also assume that these two blood cells have some measure of self-consciousness, self-awareness. Let's also assume that they start, sitting around wherever blood cells may sit around and start talking to each other and speculating about some being that they sort of dimly intuit that they're a part of. What is this like? Is this a cell like them? Well, yes and no. If you look at it this way, you radically see that, and often the mystics and visionaries say that the ultimate truth is beyond our conception for the simple reason that our nervous systems aren't really structured to experience it in its totality. Well, that shouldn't surprise us, as we all know from science, if we want to go back to science. Our eyes only see a fairly narrow bandwidth of what is even a visible spectrum. Bees, for example, can see a different wavelength of light frequencies than we can. They're clearly colors in these frequencies that we've just never seen, and I personally can't imagine. Have you ever been able to imagine a color you've never seen? I can't. I find it almost like paradox. Anyway, to go back to what I was saying earlier, there are these two quite different usages of the term God. Well, in the first place, there's the personal versus impersonal that I was talking about. But to go back previous to what I was saying earlier, you have God as this sort of something that fills in the holes in your causal chain when you don't know what those holes are. And as science has filled in those holes in the causal chain, God, in that sense, is unnecessary, or the divine, or whatever you wish to call it. But to go reiterate what I was saying before, God is this kind of lived, powerful reality that's definitely there, even though we don't necessarily know what it is not outmoded by the discoveries of science, and I don't think will be anytime soon or in anything like a future that's anything like the present. But you can see one is more or less a superstitious explanation for phenomena that are imperfectly understood, and the other is a powerful lived reality. And these meanings have been constantly confused. And as a result, people of faith have felt threatened by the encroachment of scientific explanation on their beliefs. Consequently, they've opposed science, as we see today in the debate on creationism or intelligent design, or whatever you'd like to call it. A debate that many of us believed had ended with the Scopes trial back in the 1920s, but obviously hasn't. Science, on the other hand, has jumped to the hasty conclusion that if God is unnecessary as a cause of natural phenomena, the whole idea of God or the divine or transcendent reality must therefore be meaningless. Moreover, while the official scientific view is that the concept of God is not something that science can pronounce upon, since it's obviously not provable or refutable by any known scientific method, science and adherents of scientism have tacitly acted as if they knew the answer to the question of whether God exists or not, and that it's really no. We have to pretend that we don't really know, but of course we really know the answer. To cite an extremely recent example of this attitude, I'll mention a book it's come out quite recently and has occasioned a lot of debate by the philosopher Daniel Dennett, which some of you may have seen or read or heard about, called Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon. And it advocates investigating religion as a scientific phenomenon, but it's also extremely disingenuous in the way it does it. Dennett suggests investigating religion in such a way that would only invalidate it and explain it away. Unlike William James, for example, whom he cites ceaselessly throughout this book, He has absolutely no interest in religious experiences of people and what that might mean, even though, from anything like a scientific view, that would have to be considered, raw data with which to work. The scientistic thinker, the person who wants to create science as this kind of quasi, supplement, replacement for religion, just doesn't want to see that. Or, it becomes explained away as a matter of brain processes. Well, that tells us nothing. I mean, we all know perfectly, there may be some sort of God center in the brain that kind of conditions us to experience transcendent realities. But that's no refutation. And if anything, it tends to support it. Why? Well, just the fact that you have light receptors in your eyes and in your optic system and in the brain wired back there somehow would tend to lead one to believe in the existence of such a thing as light as a natural phenomenon rather than to disbelieve it. But so my point is that if science and those who kind of advocate science as kind of the next new religion, consciously or not, overtly or not, really want to investigate it, they have to be a lot more honest about it than they have been. Any case, I do think that both the science and the religion of the future will have to carefully disentangle these two senses of the word God before we can make any genuine progress in creating a world that's meaningful and humane for all people. Only then will the long-standing struggle between two extremely different perspectives on the world finally be able to abate, and will people be able to focus truly on their commonalities rather than on their divisions. Now, you may have noticed that one theme keeps resurfacing in the comments that I've made so far. It's that of religion as a matter of lived personal experience rather than as a matter of blind faith or adherence to dogmas that are, taken on their own terms, frequently either baffling or incredible. I'm reminded of the story of the kid who, asked to define faith, said, "Faith is believing what you know ain't so." In fact, a fresh emphasis on lived experience may even enable us to revive the now somewhat moribund concept of faith. One of the earliest definitions of faith in a Christian context appears in the Epistle to the Hebrews. Faith is the evidence of things unseen. The paradox here is so acute that it seems almost like a Zen koan. Faith is evidence. The fact that it's evidence of the kind that's invisible to the body's eyes does not make it any less real. And here faith shades into something with which it is frequently contrasted: gnosis, inner knowledge, or illumination. In any case, all these issues confront us as we deal with the central topic of this conference, which is globalization and its impact on religious life and behavior. Personally, I find myself reminded of a line from that mysterious but powerful text known as A Course in Miracles. A universal theology is impossible, but a universal experience is not only possible, but necessary. The world will not, in my humble opinion, overcome its sectarian divisions by some kind of bland ecumenism in which all the common elements of the various faiths are boiled down into a flavorless soup. That has been tried over and over, and the usual result is simply to create yet another religion. The meta-denomination, if I may be bold enough to create such a barbarous word, turns into just another denomination like any other. What I am saying, by contrast, is that the world's religions may overcome some of their divisions by focusing on the lived experience of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans rather than opinions and dogmas about this mystery. Even this, as a solution, I'm quite well aware it's pointless to offer as kind of magical cure. The human mind seems to be so constructed that if two people are 99% in agreement about some subject, they will almost always fall into bitter quarreling about the remaining 1% that they disagree on. I have no idea why this is so, but it seems to be almost like a universal law. And, lest we be too shall we say, smug about it, we have to also recognize that esoteric organizations are at least as prone to this shortcoming as any other. But to return to my previous point, it seems likely, or even certain, that religion will focus more and more on experience rather than dogma. And this will present challenges of its own to the religious establishment. Literally 2 days ago, I happened to be having lunch with the head of the Knights of Columbus, which is a Catholic fraternal order of about 1.7 million members. And it was fascinating because I rarely had the chance to pick the brains of someone who's so well connected to the Catholic hierarchy. And what he told me was very, very interesting. Apparently, Pope John Paul II had created a kind of new program or agenda for Catholicism, in which the faith would not merely be about following the rules or, carrying out certain acts, but would focus more on, and I believe this is the phrase, each Catholic's path toward holiness or journey toward holiness. That is to say, John Paul II was advocating precisely the type of emphasis that I've mentioned here. This is not terribly well known, and that's because the shift has been very, very difficult to make. And that's because the hierarchy, which has been trained precisely in the old ways of thinking, legalistically and ritualistically, has by and large been unable to implement it. And that's what I was told 2 days ago by someone who's very knowledgeable about it. So here, in the single largest religious organization in the world, we see precisely the need to refocus on the experience of the individual and to deal with it in a meaningful way. While this may seem a daunting task, the tools already exist in the esoteric traditions of the world's religions, or should I say that the esoteric traditions that underlie the world's religions. The word esoteric comes from Greek words meaning further in. And esotericism has to do with going further into ourselves in order to have some conscious experience of realities that lie beyond the physical realm. Not surprisingly, we see an increased focus on esotericism and mysticism, at least in Judaism and Christianity, which are the most visible religions in our society, both of which seem to be trying to rediscover these ancient teachings and reincorporate them into the faith of modern times. Now, I don't personally have a sense of how well this effort has succeeded, whether, for example, the revitalized interest in the Kabbalah among Jews has opened up a new dimension of lived experience, or whether the rediscovery or attempted rediscovery of Christian mystical teachings and practices has done anything similar for Christianity. However these are brought back into play, these old traditions, into the modern world, I suspect that they will soon rapidly mutate into forms and systems that may not initially seem recognizably similar to those of the past, but are, even so, essentially the same teachings adapted particularly to the needs of our time. At any rate, these are all points to consider and stimuli. You'll remember that the word stimulus originally meant goad for discussion over the next 2 days. Given this particular audience, it might not be necessary to add a certain caveat, since I suspect most of you, if not all of you, are aware of this issue, but I will bring it up nonetheless. There is such a thing as dialogue, and there is also such a thing as listening in polite impenetrability while thinking of nothing but how to get your own point across. All of us do this. Standard procedure at cocktail parties and gatherings of that sort. But I think all the same that if the religions of the world are to find some way of living together in true harmony and not in some sort of truce or stalemate, they will have to overcome this temptation collectively. They'll have to find a way of genuinely listening to one another's points of view without necessarily trying to change them, convert them, or merely trying to find instances for inserting their own stories. I want to add one final point, which is there's an enormous amount of rhetoric over the last 5 years particularly. 9/11 seems to have kicked this off in force, about religion as a force for violence and intolerance. And this kind of criticism has gone back to antiquity, when Lucretius, the Roman poet, denounced pagan religion for human sacrifice, which it still sort of did. I think we need to be careful about this because there is something in human nature that seems to like violence and loves to find excuses for it. And I think we have to be very, very careful about, and very, very honest and clear about trying to say, well, is religion really the cause of all of this? Or is it merely one excuse in a long line of excuses for the actions of what's a very violent species? It's a point worth considering. If we overcome our differences in terms of religion, will there be a whole new stream of differences that we can fight over? This is particularly relevant because the greatest wars of the 20th century, the most destructive ones, were not over religion. They were territorial. First World War about the imperial nations of Europe trying to readjust their frontiers. Or in the Second World War about ideologies, which were, crazy ideologies, and they were also non-religious. Fascism and communism, like scientism, are substitutes or pseudo-religions, but they're not really religions as such, at least in the sense that you are trying to speak of some kind of transcendent reality and have some sense of it. So I think we need to be very careful about just slipping into rhetoric about all the bad things that religion has done, although, as we all know, it has done plenty of bad things. And all of the religions in their own ways seem to have done that. Anyway, I'm going to end my comments here. I think this will be a fascinating weekend. I'll be very interested to hear comments from the panelists and from all of you, and I very much look forward to it, and I'm going to, mercifully for you, perhaps stop here.
Thank you very much, Richard. One of the things that you expressed in your talk is one of the reasons that I'm particularly excited about this conference, and that is that religion can be and should be come out of a personal experience, and that is where it has its reality. And our various speakers that we have, many of whom I know or know something about, have that kind of particular personal relationship to their tradition in a way that I think that they will spark genuine interaction in a positive way that will challenge us to move into a little bit of understanding of their territory and actually by that expand our own thinking and our way of being. So I think that this is a very good beginning, and I look forward to all of it.